welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everybody. This is Evelyn Hershkowitz, Reader Services Librarian from the Syosset Public Library. We're here today on our Turn the Page podcast, and today I have with us author Kerri Maher.
Maher, yes.
Maher, okay. So Kerri is the author of The Kennedy Debutante, which came out in 2018, her second novel in 2020, The Girl in White Gloves, and the third novel, which we were talking about today, The Paris Bookseller, and it's about a trailblazing entrepreneur, Sylvia Beach, and the Shakespeare and Company. That book will be out January 11th, 2022. And she's working on her fourth historical novel, which will be out in 2023, I'm assuming, from Berkeley.
Yes.
Okay, we'll talk about that also if you would like to. She's also written a memoir called This Is Not a Writing Manual, Notes from the Young Writer in the Real World. And she's also the founder of an award-winning journal of YA literature called Yarn.
Yes.
Kerri has her MFA from Columbia University, and she also taught there as a grad student instructor in the undergrad writing program. She was a lecturer at Fairleigh Dickinson University in New Jersey. She now lives in Massachusetts, where she is a full-time author. We are so happy to be speaking with Kerri Maher on the Syosset Library's podcast, Turn the Page.
Hi, Evelyn, and thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You're very, very welcome. So where did you go to undergrad? That I didn't see in your bio.
Well, so I am really a California girl at heart, and I spent most of my growing up in California, and I went to UC Berkeley.
Oh.
And so I was an English major there with an art history minor. And actually, the story of the Paris Bookseller begins at Berkeley because I was an English major, as I said. I was obsessed with the writers of the 20s, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, that whole crew. And I just, the whole, expatriate, the Lost Generation group of writers. And, I was just fascinated by all of that. And so, in a college town where there are lots of lovely bookstores, many of those bookstores have, the used book bin out in the front with like books for $1. And so one day I just happened to be perusing those bins and I saw a little memoir called Shakespeare and Company by Sylvia Beach. And I read the back of it and learned that it was all about this amazing bookstore in Paris in the 20s. And I bought the book for the bargain price and went home and I read it. And I was just entranced by her memoir and her story. I was just fascinated. And that was when I learned for the first time that not only did she run this amazing bookstore, and Ernest Hemingway was one of her best friends, she published the first edition of James Joyce's Ulysses. And I just kind of filed it away under good to know. Like it was very interesting. And it's sort of remarkable to me that it's taken me this long to realize she deserved her own book.
Well, I'm glad that you wrote it. There's so many different tidbits and information about all these wonderful authors back in Paris. So why don't we tell our audience a little bit about the book?
Well, okay, so I've already buried the lead a little bit, right?
Okay.
So the novel is about Sylvia Beach, the American woman who went to Paris and opened the original Shakespeare and Company bookstore in Paris in 1919. She actually really my novel opens in 1917, but she opens the bookstore in 1919, and very quickly, it's the only English language bookstore and lending library. I always like to remind people, especially for this audience of library listeners, the original Shakespeare and Company was as much, if not more, library than it was bookstore. So many of the writers who and readers who came to her store, especially in the early days of the 20s, didn't have enough money to buy books, but they could afford her modest subscription fee to her library. And so they would check out books. And so she, a huge part of the space was actually a lending library. So she ran the original Shakespeare and Company bookstore in the left bank of Paris and on a little street in the Latin Quarter. And she also, in 1922, published the very first edition of James Joyce's Ulysses after it had been banned in an obscenity trial in New York that completed in 1921. So she, after the book Ulysses had been serialized over the course of several years in an American and a British literary journal. And it was actually the editors of the literary journal in New York who stood trial for publishing the quote unquote smut that was
crazy, right?
I know, Ulysses, right? And so once the work was considered obscene, all the publishers in New York and London who had been clamoring to publish it withdrew their offers, and Sylvia in Paris, offered to publish it. And
amazing how she was.
Amazing thing.
It was amazing how she's able to do that. One woman,
yes,
to be able to to even know how to publish a book. Like I wouldn't even know in this day and age how to publish a book, and she was able to do it in the early 1900s. It's amazing.
Right. Well, she's the first to admit that she did not know how to publish.
Okay.
So that's part of the story of
right.
The novel. So no big spoilers, but I think, the adventure that was publishing Ulysses, she says in her own memoir, I would never recommend that anyone publish a book like I did. Wow. But I think at the same time, she would not have traded the experience for anything in the world. I mean, it was really a remarkable thing that she did.
Yeah.
And
she was way ahead of her time.
Way ahead of her time.
Yeah. So how did you go about researching this?
Well, so unlike my previous two novels, about Kit Kennedy and then about Grace Kelly, I was able to, in this case, bring essentially a lifetime of reading that I'd already done to my understanding of a lot of these characters and the milieu that they inhabited. I had read a lot of Ernest Hemingway, and I had read some Gertrude Stein, and I had read, maybe more importantly, I had read nonfiction about this time period kind of periodically throughout my life. Because I've just been so interested in it. So I had, books that was sort of stored in my memory banks that I returned to and looked at again. There were a couple of other really important works of newer nonfiction that I had not read before, that I really read cover to cover and deeply. One of which was the main biography of Sylvia Beach. It's called Sylvia Beach and the Lost Generation. It's by Noel Riley Fitch. It's been around since the 80s, and it is still the definitive biography of Sylvia. And that was fascinating. I mean, and that is just a really top-notch, well-researched, heavily footnoted piece of nonfiction, but also really a pleasure to read. And there were two books that had come out just in the last few years about the publication of Ulysses, actually. Mm-hmm. One of which was by Kevin Birmingham, who is at Harvard. He's a professor at Harvard. And so those books kind of helped me get a sense for really what was at stake, both legally and artistically, in the trial of Ulysses, and kind of the world that Sylvia was wading into by offering to publish the book. But on a much more fun front, I mean, the books are always fun. I enjoy the research as much as I enjoy the writing, in fact. But I also got to go to Paris.
Okay, I was going to ask you that.
Yeah. So, and there's a fun story with that. So, I got the green light to write this book early in 2019, so before the pandemic. And so I went to Paris in the summer of 2019. And I really wanted to stay in this neighborhood where the bookstores, there were actually two locations of Sylvia's bookstore. She was on the Rue Dupuytren for 2 years before she moved to the more famous address on the Rue de l'Odéon, but they were right around the corner from each other. And so I wanted to stay in this neighborhood to kind of soak it up, and really so I could really write about it in as authentic a way as possible. But as you can imagine, it's really hard to find a place that's, in the Latin Quarter in Paris, that's affordable, et cetera. And I was going to stay a week, and a really good friend of mine who lives in London was going to come and stay with me for a part of the time. So I really needed kind of two bedrooms. Anyway, long story short, I'm on Airbnb doing a search, And suddenly, they had the algorithms that suddenly start showing you options.
Right.
So in the suggested options was actually a flat that was called James Joyce Flat.
Oh, wow.
Yes, right. So I was like, well, what could this possibly be? So I opened up the pictures, and indeed, it's a flat in a building that has a plaque on it. Paris is full of these plaques, where describing where famous things have happened and famous people have lived. And this plaque said that James Joyce and his family lived here in the summer of 1921 as he was writing or finishing Ulysses.
Wow.
I know. And so I knew about this flat because not only did Joyce and his family live there for a summer, the flat itself was actually owned by a French poet named Valérie Larbaud, who was a lifelong friend of Sylvia's. And so she writes about the Joyce family kind of taking over this flat in the summer of 1921 while he's finishing his book. So the flat's out of my price range. And so I message the owner, and I'm like, listen, I can't afford to stay at your place, but I'm a novel. I tell him who I am and what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. And I said, can I come and see it? Right. And it comes to pass. He lowers his rate for me. I'm able to stay in the apartment. But it is also true that it was probably not the flat. It was in the building that no one quite knows which flat it was, but it's on a beautiful little private leafy courtyard, with cobblestones. And so it was just like heaven to stay there for a week. I just felt like I was really living in a haunted place. And when I first got to Paris, it was raining, but once the rain cleared and I wandered up the street, and one block up the street is another plaque that says, this is where Ernest Hemingway first lived when he got to Paris in 1922. So I was really in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you got to go before the pandemic, though.
Yes, me too. Writers of historical fiction are able to write their novels without traveling to the place all the time. And those books are great. So I could have done it, but I feel very, very lucky that I was able to do it and stay where I stayed.
Absolutely. That's great. Had you been to Paris before? Or is this your first time?
Yeah, but a long time ago.
Okay.
I think that the last time I was in Paris, I was in college.
Okay.
So like more than 20 years.
Yeah, I get it. Been a long time.
It was the same.
Oh, really?
Yes. Obviously things were different. Like they didn't have Sephora in Paris when I was.
And there was probably a Starbucks on every other corner,
but see, that's actually the thing. Not as many as you'd think.
Okay, good.
And one of the things that I learned, if anyone out there listening who's might be going to Paris, I highly recommend the following. There's a organization called the Paris Institute. You can follow them on Instagram, which is actually how I found them. And every Saturday they do an English language bookstore tour of the Left Bank. And so they do Shakespeare and Company, but there's actually a handful of other really wonderful bookstores that sell English language books, like all in like really like a pretty like short walk. The tour takes about an hour and a half, but I learned so much. And one of the things that I learned about Paris is that the local government supports independent boutiques all over the city, which is how Paris has been able to retain a lot of its what we think of as its Parisian charm, right? Because they aren't letting the big box retailers open up a store on every street corner.
That's nice.
And so in fact, it really did feel a lot like it has always felt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, too bad we don't do that here, right?
I did have that thought too.
That would really be nice. I love all the independent stores. And talking about independent bookstores, here on Long Island, they're opening one right in Oyster Bay, which is very close to us in Syosset.
Oh, great.
Called Theodore's Bookstore, I think it's called. It's definitely Theodore, for Theodore Roosevelt, who had a house in Oyster Bay. So that's going to be opening very shortly. So yeah, we're looking forward to that, because the other independent bookstore that we had close to us in Huntington closed recently, Book Review. I don't know if you've ever been there or heard of it. Yeah, so that closed. So we really don't have any independent bookstores anymore around here. So it'll be nice to have a new one opening, because
good.
certainly missed. I mean, library is one thing, but there's also nothing like an independent bookstore. So
I agree. I totally agree.
Have you been able to get out at all? I mean, this book doesn't come out till January. Do you have a scheduled plan to go out and in-person bookstores, or is it all going to be virtual?
No, I'm doing both. And in fact, if you go to my Instagram page, and I always like to invite people to follow me, Instagram is where I'm most active. Like, it's really, people can really find me there. Like, I will talk to people in the comments. So I have one card on Instagram that has my live tour of events I'm doing live, and another one with my virtual tour. So I have 4 really terrific virtual events. So I am not coming to Long Island, although I am doing an event in New York City.
Oh, very nice.
On February 2nd, which is the official actual 100th anniversary of Sylvia's edition of Ulysses.
Wow.
So it's a centennial event. I'm doing it with a film group that is making what they're calling a hybrid documentary called The Remarkable Feminists. And it's about the 6 remarkable feminists behind James Joyce's Ulysses. And of course, Sylvia was one of the most important. And so they're going to do a screening, a sneak peek of the film on this February 2nd event. So that should be really fun. And even more fun, if they can complete the renovation, it's supposed to be at the Jefferson Market Library, which is in the Village in the city. But this library used to be a courthouse. It used to be the Jefferson Market Courthouse. And it was, in fact, the courthouse where Ulysses was tried in 1921. Wow,
that's just amazing.
I know, right? Doesn't
you have it all going like full circle. That's great that you were able to get all of this. Wow.
Yeah, the whole thing about the courthouse, actually, and that's now a library, which is so appropriate that it's now a library, right? Like, that was a whole rabbit hole I went down one whole day in my reading and research. Like, honestly, I was like revising the book. It was early in my writing process, but I was revising the book, and I wanted to describe the courthouse in a scene. And so I just Googled it to see if it was still there. And that was when I discovered that it had become a library.
That's really pretty. I'd like to go see that. Maybe I'll try to get into the city and come on that day. That would be nice. I would enjoy that very much. Wow. How long did it take you to write this book?
So this book, from the time that I started really researching and writing it in earnest to publication, has been 3 years. Oh. But, I haven't really been working on the book per se by the time it comes out, I wouldn't have been working on it for about 6 months, Right. So it took like a year and like 18 months probably to research and write. And truly, I always like to say this whenever I'm given the opportunity, because I was writing about this famous group of writers who did so much writing of their own and have become and are so important to the history of literature. So much has been written about them. I could have spent a decade just researching this book and never writing it. So I really had to make some tough choices kind of about what was the most important information for me to really research and read in depth in order to sort of meet my own deadlines and get the book written.
Was your first draft much longer and you had to cut a lot out, or?
Yes, this is definitely an example of this is a book that had many iterations.
Right.
A very early version had a second character, another point of view character, and I was going to go back and forth between Sylvia's point of view and her point of view, but it quickly became apparent to me that character made no sense.
Okay.
So she had to go. And I'm glad. I think, I was really glad that I was able to frame the story as Sylvia's story, because her life was just amazingly large. I mean, and the things that she did were really, as you said at the beginning, 100 years ago, I mean, here she was, this incredible entrepreneur. She was an absolute visionary. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, her and her partner, I mean, that wasn't frowned upon in Paris like it is in the United States, or was. I want to say was in the United States.
Yeah, Adrienne. Yeah, we haven't talked very much about Adrienne. So Adrienne, so really the original inspiration for Shakespeare and Company was a store called La Maison des Amis de Livres, which was the House of the Friends of Books.
Okay.
It was owned by a French woman named Adrienne Monnier on the Rue de l'Odéon. And essentially Sylvia sort of just went to her store one day as a customer and like fell in love with the place. You know, Adrienne, in addition to running an absolutely charming book, it was also a bookstore and lending library. It was for French literature, but it was a bookstore and lending library. And she also had this incredible series of like readings where all the well-known, you know, progressive bohemian writers read their work and discussed it. So it was really a hub of literary activity. And Sylvia, it wasn't long before Sylvia and Adrienne also fell in love with each other. And they embarked upon a romantic and a business partnership that lasted close to 2 decades. Well, it actually lasted longer than that. You have to read the book to find out what happens. But they were lifelong partners in one way or another. But they were absolutely romantic partners for all of the 20s and most of the 30s. And Adrienne was a few years younger than Sylvia, but she had already opened this bookstore as a very young woman during the First World War. So in 1915. So she was quite an inspiration to Sylvia, and it was really fun to get to portray them as a couple. You know, something interesting that I learned about the sort of queer history in writing this book is that the 20s was kind of a special moment. Gay and lesbian bars and cabarets were absolutely chic. For everybody, for people of all sexual orientations in the 20s in major metropolitan areas like New York, Paris, and Berlin. Now, in Paris was a special case because same-sex relations had been decriminalized in France since the time of the French Revolution.
Wow, they're way
right.
ahead.
So that is why Paris has always had this reputation as kind of a bastion of openness, where people, queer people can kind of be themselves. Now, it was still the 20s, right? So all social mores for all couples were a little bit more conservative, right? Like you weren't going to get a heterosexual couple like making out on the street corner,
right?
But in particular in this very bohemian enclave that Sylvia and Adrienne lived in, they were able to live. I think, as everyone knew that they were a couple. It was an accepted thing, not unlike Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas, who lived not far from them. So they were also, an accepted couple. There was another very famous and very desirable salon to get invited to, run by this American woman named Natalie Barney. She never makes an appearance in the book as a character, but someone mentions her salon in my book. And so they were, everyone wanted to get invited to Natalie's salon. She had all the famous writers and artists and dancers and everyone come to her house. It's a beautiful, big, beautiful palace of a place in Paris. She was a very wealthy woman.
Yeah, no, it's nice that they were able to live like that and enjoy each other. And it's wonderful. Paris I've never been, so maybe one day I'll be lucky enough to get there. But it sounds like a great place to be.
It was great. And, it gave me, she really was, Sylvia and Hemingway really were very good friends. Mm-hmm. But because there was never any romantic entanglement between the two of them, I was able to kind of like look at Hemingway in a very different way, almost like as a brother. He was more of like a little brother to her in ways. And so that was really fun to be able to like look at Hemingway during these years, not as like the not very good husband that he was. And and all of that stuff. Although I have certainly enjoyed those books, and The Paris Wife is one of my absolute hands down.
That's so funny that you mentioned that book. When I first started working here and I was in library school, the very first book that I did as a book discussion was The Paris Wife.
Oh,
I thought, I loved that book also. I thought that was excellent. Yeah, you
Yeah.
learned so much about everybody in that one too.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, so that one, I always like to say that was one of my touchstone, like sort of mentor texts. I read that about 10 years ago in a book club.
Right.
And I had no thought at the time that I would ever write historical fiction. I just read it. I loved it. And I guess I hadn't ever read a novel that really took a real person like that and wrote a novel about that person, like Hadley Richardson. And I just thought, wow, good to know. Like not unlike reading Sylvia's memoir all those years ago. I just filed it away under good to know. And then when I stumbled on the story of Kathleen Kennedy, my first historical novel, I thought of The Paris Wife, and I was like, I wonder if there's like a novel like that in her story. And so there was. And now what we call biographical fiction is
so popular. Like a genre all onto itself, practically. There is so many books, and I love them all. I mean, I think that is like the greatest thing. I love reading all the biographical historical fiction. So before you became a writer, you were just teaching? Is that what you were doing before? Or?
Well, I have always been a writer, I have to say. I wrote my first unpublished novel in 5th grade.
Wow.
I know, which is funny because my daughter is now in 5th grade. So I wrote my first completed novel right out of college. So I have always written, and, people, anytime anyone asks me, how did you know you were going to be a writer? Or how does anyone know that they're going to be a writer? And my answer is always this. I'm like, because you wake up one morning and you are so grouchy, and you realize that it's because you haven't written in some amount of time. Like there's something you need to be writing. And, that amount of time is different for different people. Sometimes it's 2 weeks, sometimes it's 2 years, but it's only the writing that will make you feel better. And I'm definitely someone who is like that. I've taken a variety of hiatuses to do other things, try other things, but the writing has really always, the creative writing, the fiction writing has really always been in me as like something I have to do. So after college, I worked at an independent bookstore in Brooklyn called the Community Bookstore. And I wrote my first novel. And time went on. I got an MFA, a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Columbia in fiction. I wrote some other books that did not get published. And I taught. I taught as a graduate student, and I taught then full-time as a faculty member at Fairleigh Dickinson. Mostly I taught kind of the required freshman writing classes, but I did also teach some creative writing. I actually taught creative writing mostly online. Just to think of now with all the learning that's gone online, I really enjoyed teaching creative writing online. It worked much better than I thought it was going to. So I did that. And then around the same time I got pregnant with my daughter, my husband at the time, we're now divorced. He changed jobs, and we moved. We were living in Connecticut, and then we moved up to Massachusetts. And so that was sort of a big life change. Like, we decided that I would stay home with our daughter. And at that point Yarn was really chugging along, my literary journal at that point, really chugging along. So I was sort of able to work on Yarn and do some writing while my daughter napped, or, eventually she was in preschool. And, most of my very first historical novel I wrote while she was in preschool. Like I would drop her off, I had 3 hours. I would drop her off. I would get home, make a second pot of coffee, and I would be like, okay, I have 2.5 hours before I have to get in the car again and pick her up. That was how the Kennedy Debutante got written.
How hard was it to get that one published?
Well, so that was the easiest of all of them. For a whole bunch of complicated reasons, I also had to look for a new literary agent at that point. I had a previous agent who I really liked, who left publishing altogether. And so I had to find an agent. But I must say, I think it was largely because of the subject matter, the Kennedy, the Kennedy family, everyone wants to know about them.
Right. I'm obsessed. I've always read and loved everything about the Kennedys. So
yeah, they are really, they are endlessly fascinating.
Right.
So I was pretty quickly able to find an agent, and that agent was able to sell the book pretty quickly also. So
great. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. I have to say, people talk about this kind of thing all the time. It was like my 20-year overnight success, right?
Yeah.
It took a long time, but when it was the right book, it happened fairly quickly. But it took me a long time to get there. And I always like to talk about that as much as I can, because there are often people out there listening who have books in them or have been working on a book or many books or something for years and years and years. And I just want to say to you, keep working on it. The writing life is a very, very, very long life. And, even people who have early success, that is no guarantee that it's going to continue.
Mm-hmm.
You have to really, I do the writing. It is in fact my job right now, and I hope that it will always be. But I really love it, and you have to love it to be able to continue doing it through the lows.
Right.
There's so much no in publishing. Even once you get published, there are so many other ways in which you're told no. So you have to just be prepared for all that.
Yeah. Are you a planner or a pantser?
Oh, so before historical fiction, I was a devoted pantser. Absolutely. I hated the idea of outlining. I was like, no. But with historical fiction, I had to become a plotter. Now, I am not there's still an element of pantsing. Basically what I do, my process thus far has been, I do all this research and I take a bunch of notes, which I organize in a kind of subdivided chronological format. And so I have, and this very long document winds up becoming like a kind of outline and a menu of events from which I can choose to create scenes, right? Like there are some scenes that I know I'm going to have to write, like in the case of Grace Kelly, my last book, I knew I had to write her wedding. I had to write something about Rear Window, things like that. So there are certain like marquee events that I know that I have to tackle, but the rest is kind of like pick and choose. So I really like that. It turns out I really like that. So I think I'm definitely more of a plotter now.
Okay.
But there's an element of there's still an element of when I sit down, what is it going to be today? Like I haven't planned it out to that level of detail. Okay, well, so I want to let people know that if they want to get a signed, if you want to pre-order a signed copy, you can call up or go online to Wellesley Books. They are my local independent bookstore. They are my Shakespeare and Company. And I'm doing my official live book launch is going to be there. So if you're listening and you happen to live in the Boston area, you could certainly come to that. So on January 11th, but if what you would want is to pre-order a copy and you'd like it signed, that is where you go to get a signed pre-ordered copy.
Fabulous. Is that the town, Wellesley?
Yeah, Wellesley, like where the college is. And
wow. Okay.
Yeah, I feel lucky. I live, not far from Boston and all the great stuff there. And then Wellesley's a terrific town. I actually live in a town called Weston, which is just a small little, like very pretty little New England town.
Beautiful. Yeah.
It's close to things.
Did you have snow the other day?
No, did you?
No
have
snow yet. No, we haven't had snow. No.
I know New Hampshire's had some snow.
Yeah.
But we haven't had it yet.
No, yesterday it was 70 degrees.
Same. It was also, it was crazy.
Yesterday was the type of day that you wish was always, like every day you wanted to be like yesterday. It was just an absolutely gorgeous day. So, and today it's in the 40s. So
Yeah.
You never
Well, I
know.
don't mind. I like winter. Cold weather is good writing weather, and rainy weather is good writing weather. I've always felt that way, even from when I was in like the little fifth grader writing my first book, trying to write my first book. I was like, oh, it's a rainy day. I'm gonna like curl up somewhere with my. I think that was before I tried using a computer. I think I had a legal pad, a yellow legal pad of my dad's.
Yeah. And where do you write? At home, or did you used to go to
Yeah, so
coffee shops?
I've always written at home. I have a desk, but it's funny. And I use my desk pretty often, but the Paris Bookseller and this next one have wanted to be written on the couch, which is where I'm sitting right now. So I don't know, like certain books seem to want to be written in certain places. So I've written a lot on the couch lately.
Wherever you're comfortable, I guess. I guess if you're comfortable, it works, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. I just want to, your book has been blurbed by some wonderful people. I just want to read the one by Fiona Davis.
Oh, thank you.
It's so wonderful. I love the praise that she gave you. She says, if you've ever dreamed you can transport yourself to Paris in the 1920s, to Sylvia Beach's famous bookstore where Joyce, Hemingway, and Pound wandered the aisles, this story's for you. Mayer's magical touch brings to life a woman whose struggle resonates in today's world, while also examining the intricacies of friendship, fortitude, and love of the written word. And that one's by Fiona Davis, New York Times bestselling author of The Lions of Fifth Avenue. I thought that was just wonderful what she said about it. So
it was. I mean, and Fiona herself is such an amazing talent. I mean, her novel Lions of Fifth Avenue is one of my favorites.
Yeah, that was very good. I enjoyed that one too. But
yeah,
no, I want to thank you for being with us.
Thank you again for having me. It was a lot of fun chatting with you.
Yes, it was wonderful chatting with you too. And I wish you a very happy holiday season.
You too. I hope the library is bustling and lively and fun to be in the coming months.
We certainly are. So I want to end this chapter of Turn the Page. And I thank Kerri so much for speaking with us. The book is The Paris Bookseller. No one's going to see this, but I'm holding up the cover.
Oh, thank you.
Paris Bookseller. It's a wonderful book. I recommend that everybody read it. And please know that we will have copies on our shelf. Please call us or email us or text us or come on in and we'll put it on reserve for you. And it's also going to be available on Overdrive. So if anybody's interested in reading it on Overdrive/Libby, it'll be there for you also. So Kerri, thank you so much. Have a great day. And we look forward to speaking to you again when the next book comes out.
Awesome. Thank you again, Evelyn.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.